She said it the way you say something about the weather. Naïve et facilement manipulable. Naïve and easily controlled. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't check whether I understood. She simply said it, reached for her wine glass, and moved on. That was the moment I understood what the week was going to require of me. The restaurant was called Field, and it sat at the end of a gravel road in Rockport with a view of the harbor that my wife had loved. I had chosen it deliberately. The table by the window, the one with the unobstructed line to the water I had called ahead, and reserved it 3 days before. The maître d'hôtel, a man named Thomas, who had worked that floor for 14 years, had confirmed it twice. I remember thinking, standing in the parking lot before I went in, that Molly looked the way her mother used to look before important dinners, shoulders back, chin up, the careful brightness of someone trying very hard to make something work. She was 31 years old, and she was trying to make her future in-laws like her. I watched her do it from across the table for 2 hours, and I want to tell you what that looked like. I had driven up from Portland that afternoon, the same route I had driven for 33 years through Brunswick, past the bridge at Bath, where I had worked on a highway overpass project in 1994, up the coast road, where the trees thin out and you start to smell the Atlantic before you see it. I had learned French at 22 in Lyon, where I spent 5 years working for an engineering firm that had a contract with a bridge restoration project outside the city. My French was not the French of a classroom. It was the French of early mornings on a job site, of lunch in a brasserie where nobody spoke English, of learning to argue about load tolerances in a second language because the alternative was losing the argument. I had not spoken it in years. There was nobody to speak it with in Portland, Maine. Beatrice and Jean-Luc Moreau had arrived from Montreal 2 days earlier. Julien, their son, Molly's fiancé, had picked them up from the airport in his car. He had not called to ask if I wanted to join the drive. I had noted that, but I hadn't said anything about it. Molly had apologized on his behalf, the way she had been apologizing on his behalf for small things for the past 8 months. I had noted that too. I got to Field before them and was already seated when they came through the door. Thomas led them to the table, and I stood. Beatrice came first, a tall woman, 60s, with the particular posture of someone who expected rooms to accommodate her. She wore a dark jacket and kept her coat over her arm rather than handing it to the host. Jean-Luc was shorter, heavier, with the careful smile of a man managing something he didn't want to show. Julien walked behind them with Molly beside him, her hand through his arm, and she was smiling the smile I had seen on her face since she was 7 years old and trying to convince me she wasn't nervous about something. We shook hands. I said it was a pleasure to meet them. Beatrice said, in English, that the drive had been long. Jean-Luc said the harbor was beautiful. I agreed that it was. We sat down. The first 20 minutes were fine. Thomas brought water and the bread basket, and we talked about the drive from Montreal and the weather in Maine in October and whether the wedding venue, a resort property called Harborstone, 12 miles up the coast, would be cold by the 3rd Saturday of the month. Julien translated occasionally when his parents' English slowed, which it did when the conversation moved past pleasantries. His French was his parents' French Quebecois with Belgian edges, the vowels slightly flatter than Lyon, but clear to me in every word. I kept my face the way I had learned to keep it on job sites when a contractor said something I needed to hear without knowing I was listening. Neutral, slightly interested, nothing more. Molly ordered the halibut. She asked Beatrice if she liked fish, and Beatrice said she preferred it to the alternatives in this part of the country. She said it in English. What she said a moment later to Jean-Luc was in French, and it was not about the fish. She said, and I am translating carefully, because the words matter, she said that Molly seemed like the kind of girl who would agree to anything if you smiled at her first. Naïve was the word she used. Naïve et facilement manipulable. Naïve and easily controlled. She said it the way you say something about the weather, not cruelly, which would have required some acknowledgement that cruelty was possible. She said it the way you state a fact you have already verified. I picked up my water glass. I drank. I set it back down. Jean-Luc responded, also in French, that this was useful. He used the word commode, convenient. He said that her father seemed agreeable. He glanced at me when he said it, and I held his gaze for a moment with the same expression I had been wearing all evening. He looked back at his menu. Molly was talking to Julian about the centerpieces for the reception tables. She had been working on them for 3 weeks, small arrangements of dried sea lavender and white ranunculus that she had assembled herself at the kitchen table in her apartment, spreading them out on newspaper and trimming the stems with the small scissors she had used since art school. She was describing the color of the ribbon she had chosen. Julian was nodding. I watched his face while she talked, and I wanted to be precise about what I saw. He was not listening. He was waiting for her to finish. Halfway through the main course, Beatrice turned and looked at the wall behind my left shoulder. I had hung a photograph there. Not hung, exactly. Thomas had been kind enough to let me bring it and prop it on the narrow ledge near our table. It was a photograph of the bookcase I had built for Molly's apartment the previous spring, floor to ceiling. White oak, with the angled supports I had designed myself after she mentioned she wanted something that could hold her art books without bowing. I had spent 4 weekends on it. The photograph was one she had taken when it was finished, before the books went in, and she had texted it to me with 3 words, "Dad, it's perfect." Beatrice looked at it for a moment. Then she said to Jean-Luc, in French, that it looked like something salvaged from a construction site. Des débris de chantier. Construction debris. She said the word bricolage, amateur work, handyman work, and she made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was designed to produce the same effect. I cut my fish. I ate it. It was good. Thomas had recommended the preparation, and he had been right. Jean-Luc said something I didn't fully catch about the grain of the wood. Beatrice said it didn't matter because it wouldn't be in the new apartment anyway. The new apartment. I filed that. I did not react. Molly said, to the table in general, that her father had built it for her. She said it with the particular brightness she uses when she is proud of something and uncertain whether the other person will understand why. Beatrice said, in English, that it was very nice. She smiled when she said it. She had a precise smile. It reached exactly as far as it needed to, and no further. I said thank you. I meant something else entirely, but I said thank you. The plates were cleared. Thomas brought the dessert menus and a small dish of salted caramels that Field was known for. Molly took one. Julian's mother did not. The conversation had moved to the wedding schedule, the rehearsal dinner on Friday, the ceremony Saturday at 2, the reception to follow. I answered questions about parking and the shuttle from the hotel. I was pleasant. I was, as I have been told, I can be when I choose to. Quite easy to talk to. It was during this interval the dessert menus open, the caramels on the table, Molly and Julian discussing the shuttle timing, that Beatrice leaned slightly toward Julian and asked him, in French, whether the papers were ready. Les papiers sont prêts. Julian did not look at me. He was looking at his mother, and he said yes. They were ready. He said, and I want you to understand that I heard this clearly, that I was not mishearing or misinterpreting, that my French is not a classroom French and never has been. He said, son père est trop prévisible. Il signera n'importe quoi pour la rendre heureuse. Her father is too predictable. He will sign anything to make her happy. Beatrice made a small sound of satisfaction. Not triumph, something quieter than triumph, the sound of a plan proceeding as expected. She picked up her wine glass. She drank. I looked at my hands on the tablecloth. My hands are a carpenter's hands, an engineer's hands, wide across the knuckle, marked by 35 years of work. I had built bridges in 3 states. I had worked on a harbor restoration project in Portland that was still standing, that would still be standing when everyone at this table was gone. I looked at my hands, and I thought about what Julian had just said, and I thought about what it meant for my daughter, and I thought about the word previsible, predictable, and whether he was right. He was not right, but he did not know that yet. Molly was laughing at something Julian had said. It was a real laugh, the full one, the one that goes back to when she was 8, and I used to read to her on Sunday mornings. I watched her laugh, and I thought she does not know. She is sitting at this table, and she does not know what the people beside her have just said about her. She does not know about the papers, whatever they are. She does not know that the man she is going to marry in 5 days looked at his mother just now with the particular expression of a person confirming a schedule. I know that expression. I have seen it in project meetings, in contract negotiations, in rooms where one party has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. I have been the person who decided the outcome. I have also been the person who walked in thinking it was a conversation and discovered it was a closing. I was not going to be that person again. Thomas came with the dessert. I ordered the apple tart. I ate it slowly. I talked about the harbor and the wedding weather and the shuttle schedule and the rehearsal dinner on Friday. I was, by every visible measure, an agreeable man having a pleasant dinner with his daughter's future in-laws. And I listened to every word they said. When we stood to leave, and Beatrice shook my hand again, firm, brief, the handshake of someone who has already assessed you, I held it for exactly the appropriate amount of time and said that I was looking forward to the rest of the week. She said she was as well. Her English was very good when she wanted it to be. In the parking lot, Molly hugged me and said the dinner had gone well. I told her it had. She looked relieved in the way she had been looking relieved for the past 8 months, as though something she had been bracing for had not yet arrived. I drove home on the coast road. The harbor lights were behind me, and ahead of it was the dark and the smell of the Atlantic and 40 miles of road I knew by heart. I did not turn on the radio. I had things to think about. The word previsible sat in my chest like a splinter, and I had learned a long time ago that the correct response to a splinter is not to ignore it. The correct response is to remove it cleanly, at the right moment, with the right tool. I had 5 days. I woke at 5:15 the next morning without an alarm. That had been happening since my wife died. The body finds its own schedule when there is no one else to consider. I made coffee in the kitchen, stood at the window that faces the water, and watched the light come up over the cove. The tide was going out. I could hear it more than see it. I called Grant Ferris at 6:30. He picks up early. He always has, in the 31 years I've known him. Grant spent 18 years as a risk analyst for a regional bank before he went independent. He does financial background work, now the kind that takes a day when it needs to take a day, and a week when it needs to take a week. I had referred him 3 clients over the years, and he had referred me 2. We had an understanding that did not require explanation on either end. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed something fast. I gave him the names Beatrice Marchand Voss, Jean-Luc Marchand Voss, and Julian Marchand Voss. I told him they were French-Belgian, that Jean-Luc ran a wine import business out of Portland, and that Julian was engaged to my daughter. I told him I needed anything that touched financial exposure debt, litigation, regulatory filings, anything in the last 5 years. Grant said, "How fast is fast?" I said, "Today, if you can manage it." He didn't ask why. That was the thing about Grant. He had been in the business long enough to know that when someone calls at 6:30 in the morning asking for same-day turnaround, the reason is already sitting in the room with them. I told him one more thing before I hung up. I said, "They've mentioned something about papers, something they want my daughter to sign. I don't know the specifics yet." Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's useful to know." I said I thought it might be. Molly called at 8:15. She wanted to know if I'd enjoyed dinner. I told her the food had been good. She asked what I'd thought of Beatrice and Jean-Luc. I told her they seemed very committed to the wedding. She laughed a little, the way she does when she's not sure whether something is a compliment or not. I did not tell her what I had heard. I had thought about it carefully on the drive home, and again through the early morning, and the answer was the same each time. If I told Molly what Beatrice had said, previsible, provincial, the remark about the dress, she would confront Julian. Julian would tell his mother. Beatrice would adjust. The papers, whatever they were, would be handled differently, more carefully, in a way I could not see or prepare for. The thing about a plan that has already been set in motion is that you do not stop it by announcing that you know about it. You stop it by waiting until the moment it cannot be stopped any other way. Molly was happy. She had been happy for 8 months, and I had watched it carefully because it was the particular happiness of someone who wants very much to believe what they are seeing. I was not going to take that from her one day before I had to. I was going to take it from the people who had put her in that position. I told her I'd see her at the rehearsal dinner Thursday. She said she loved me. I told her I loved her too. Both of those things were true. Grant called back at 4:17 in the afternoon. I was at my drafting table, old habit. I still work at a drafting table reviewing structural drawings for a small retaining wall project in Rockport. I pushed the drawings aside. He had results. He said he wanted to walk me through them in order. Jean-Luc Marchand Voss, the wine import company, Voss and Marchand Imports LLC, had filed 2 extensions on federal tax returns in the past 3 years. The most recent extension had lapsed without a filing. There was an IRS notice of deficiency on record. Grant had found it through a public lien search amounting to just over $240,000. The company had 2 outstanding loans from a commercial lender in Massachusetts. Both passed their grace periods. Grant's estimate, based on the public filings alone, was that the company was between 4 and 6 months from a forced closure. I wrote the numbers down on the back of an envelope. Julien Marchand Voss, there was a civil complaint filed in the Paris Commercial Court 18 months ago. The plaintiff was a private investment group. The complaint alleged misrepresentation in connection with a real estate syndication deal. Julien had represented himself as a licensed intermediary when he was not. The case had not gone to judgment yet, but it had not been dismissed either. It was sitting in the system, waiting. Grant paused there. Then he said, "Mark, I want to ask you something." I told him to go ahead. He said, "The papers they want your daughter to sign. Do you have any idea what kind of papers?" I said I didn't have the documents. I had only heard the word. Grant said, "Based on what I'm looking at, there are 2 things that would make sense. One is a co-signature on a loan if Jean-Luc is trying to refinance the business debt. A new family member with clean credit and no prior exposure would be useful. The other is a property-backed instrument if your daughter owns anything outright, or if she's listed as a beneficiary on anything. A transfer or lien at the time of marriage would accomplish something similar." I said, "Molly owns a condominium in Portland. I helped her buy it 6 years ago. It's in her name. Clear title." Grant said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's probably the answer." I had already arrived at the same answer, somewhere around mile 30 on the coast road the night before, but hearing it confirmed in Grant's voice, flat, professional, without drama, made it settle differently. It was not a suspicion anymore. It was a structure. It had dimensions and load-bearing points, the same as any structure I had ever worked on. And the same principle applied. If you understand where the weight is sitting, you know exactly where to place the lever. I thanked Grant and told him to send me everything he had in writing. He said, "You going to be all right?" I said I was going to be fine. After I hung up, I sat at the drafting table for a while without moving. The light outside had gone the particular gray that comes off the water in late afternoon in October. I thought about Molly at 6 years old, standing in the frame of the back door of the house in Rockport with her boots on the wrong feet, insisting she had them right. I thought about her at 22, calling me from a job site in Boston at 11 at night because a contractor had tried to talk down to her and she had wanted to talk it through. I thought about the way she had looked at Julien at dinner the previous night with the full, unguarded attention of someone who has decided to trust completely. She had not made a mistake in trusting. She had simply trusted the wrong person. Those are not the same thing, and I have never confused them. I made one more call before the day was done. Patricia Chen had sold me 2 properties and helped Molly buy her condominium. She had been in residential real estate in Cumberland County for 23 years, and she had the particular quality of a person who notices everything and volunteers nothing. I had always respected that about her. She picked up on the 3rd ring. I told her I had a favor to ask. I said I needed her at the wedding on Saturday, not as a guest, exactly, but present. I told her there might be a moment when I would need a witness who understood property transactions, and I wanted that witness to be someone I trusted. Patricia said, "Mark, do I want to know more than that right now?" I said, "Probably not." She said, "Saturday at the Harbor View Resort. What time does it start?" I told her 2 o'clock. She said, "I'll be there at 1:30. I told her I appreciated it. She said she'd heard that before, and it had always turned out to be interesting. Then she hung up. I put the phone down and looked at the envelope where I had written Grant's numbers. $240,000 in tax liens, a civil fraud complaint sitting in a Paris court, a condominium in Portland with clear title, and a daughter who had no idea any of this existed. Predictable, Beatrice had said. I folded the envelope in half and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. She had no idea how right she was. I called Beatrice at 8:15 the next morning. The guest house sat 60 yards from the main house, separated by a gravel path and a stand of white pines that my wife had planted in 1994. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a view of the cove, and a porch where you could hear the tide coming in if the wind was right. I had not used it since my sister visited 3 years ago. I had cleaned it the evening before, changed the linens, and set a bottle of sparkling water on the kitchen counter. When Beatrice answered, her voice was warm, the warmth that certain people produce without effort, the kind that moves toward you before they've decided whether they mean it. I said, "Beatrice, I've been thinking. We have less than a week before the wedding. I'd love for you and Jean-Luc to stay at my guest house. Let's get to know each other better before Saturday." There was a pause, short, but I noticed it. Then she said, "Mark, that is so generous. We would be delighted." I told her the guest house had a full kitchen if she wanted to cook, or she was welcome at my table for any meal. I told her the porch had a good view of the water. I told her I'd leave the key under the mat. She said, "You are too kind. Julian always said his future father-in-law was a very generous man." I said, "I try." After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a moment. The cove was flat and gray that morning. A single loon was working the far edge, diving and surfacing in the same small area, patient and methodical. I watched it for a while, then went to make a second pot of coffee. They arrived at 11 with 2 suitcases and a case of wine. Jean-Luc carried the wine case himself, the way a man carries something he wants you to notice. He set it on my kitchen counter and said it was a Bordeaux from a producer he represented. Very good year. He wanted me to have it. I thanked him and set it on the counter next to the sparkling water I had put out for them. He looked at the sparkling water. He looked at the wine. Then he looked at me with the particular expression of a man recalibrating. I said, "Let me show you the guest house." Beatrice walked the property the way a buyer walks a house she has already decided to purchase. She noted the porch, the kitchen layout, the view of the cove. She said it was charming. She said the white pines were beautiful. I told her my wife had planted them. She said she had wonderful taste and touched the bark of the nearest tree with 2 fingers. Briefly, the way you touch something you are appraising. I said she did. We had dinner together that first evening. I made a fish chowder from a recipe my wife had written on an index card that I still kept taped inside the cabinet door. Jean-Luc talked about the wine business. He described his distribution network with the confidence of a man who has told the same story many times and found that it works. He named 3 restaurants in Portland that carried his label. He described a new partnership he was building with a hotel group in Boston. I asked questions. I asked what the import margins looked like in the current market. I asked whether the Boston Hotel Group was the Whitmore chain or the smaller one on the harbor. I asked whether he was still working with the same freight broker he'd used when he first established the Portland accounts. He answered each question smoothly. The answers were detailed and plausible. A man who didn't know what I knew would have believed every word. I refilled his glass and asked about the Bordeaux he'd brought. He lit up. He talked for 12 minutes about that wine. I timed it without looking at my watch, the way you learn to do when you've spent 30 years in site meetings listening to contractors explain why a pour was delayed. Jean-Luc talked about terroir and vintage variation and the particular quality of limestone soil in the region where that producer worked. He was genuinely knowledgeable. That was the thing about Jean-Luc, the knowledge was real. Only the financial structure behind it was not. I said, "It sounds like the business has good bones." He said, "Very good bones. We're in a growth period." I said, "That's wonderful to hear." The second day, Beatrice found me in the garden. I was pulling spent stalks from the raised beds along the south fence, the ones I had built the summer my daughter turned 12. Beatrice came down the gravel path with her coffee and stopped at the garden gate. She was wearing a linen shirt and small gold earrings, and she looked, in that morning light, like a woman who had always known exactly where she was going. She asked about the beds. I told her what grew there in seasoned tomatoes, basil, a row of French beans that never did as well as I hoped. She told me she kept a garden in Brussels, roses mostly, some lavender along the front wall. She described it with real affection. The lavender detail was specific enough that I believed it. I asked how long she had lived in Brussels. She said 15 years, since Jean-Luc's business expanded into the Belgian market. Before that, Lyon. Before that, a small town in the Dordogne where she had grown up. I said, "The Dordogne, that's beautiful country." She looked at me with a small, pleased expression, the kind that surfaces when someone says the expected thing at the expected moment. She said, "You know it." I said, "I spent some time in France when I was younger, before engineering school, a summer in Bordeaux, then a semester in Paris." She said, "How lovely. Did you study French?" I said, "A little, enough to get around." She smiled and sipped her coffee. The morning was cool, and the tide was out, and the mud flats along the cove were catching the early light. She looked at the water and said something about how peaceful it was here, how she understood why Molly loved it, how she hoped Julian would bring her back often. I said, "I hope so too." On the third day, I was reading at the kitchen table when I heard them on the porch of the guest house. The windows were open. It was mid-morning, quiet. The kind of quiet that carries sound across 60 yards of gravel and pine needles without effort. Beatrice was speaking to Jean-Luc in French. She said, and I am translating exactly, because I have translated it many times since "Il est encore plus naïf que sa fille. Demain, les papiers seront signés." He is even more naive than his daughter. By tomorrow, the papers will be signed. Jean-Luc said something I couldn't fully catch. Something about the attorney and a timing question. Beatrice said, "Ne t'inquiète pas, il ne comprend rien. Don't worry. He understands nothing." I set down my book. I looked at the coffee cup in front of me. The coffee had been hot when I poured it 20 minutes ago. It was cold now. I picked up the cup and went to the door and called across the gravel path, "Beatrice, Jean-Luc comes have some coffee. I just made a fresh pot." There was a brief pause. Then Beatrice's voice came back, warm and easy. "We'll be right there. Mark." I went back inside and poured 2 more cups. When they came in, Beatrice was smiling. Jean-Luc was smiling. I set the cups on the table and sat down across from them and asked Beatrice how her roses did in the Belgian winters, whether she mulched them or just cut them back hard and trusted the roots. She talked about her roses for a long time. I listened to every word. That evening, Molly called. She sounded bright and a little breathless, the way she sounds when she is managing too many things at once and trying not to show it. She told me the florist had confirmed the centerpieces, that the caterer had the final head count, that Julian's cousin was flying in from Antwerp and would need to be picked up from the Portland airport Friday morning. I asked, "What time does the ceremony start?" She said, 4 o'clock. The cocktail hour is at 6. Dinner at 7. It's going to be beautiful. Dad, the resort looks incredible. I said, "I'm sure it does." She said, "Dad, you're giving the toast. Right, Julian's uncle is going to say something, but you're first." I said, "I am. I have something important to say." There was a small silence. Then she said, "Don't make it too long. You know how you get." I said, "It won't be long." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The house was quiet. Through the window, I could see the light still on in the guest house porch. 2 figures there, talking. Occasionally a gesture, Beatrice's hand moving as she made a point. I thought about the summer I had spent in Bordeaux at 22, a program through my engineering school, a cost-sharing arrangement with a French university, 3 months in a city that smelled like stone and river water and bread. I had arrived speaking almost nothing and left speaking enough to be understood in most situations. I had not used it much in the years since a few site meetings with French-Canadian contractors in the early 90s. A conference in Montreal in 2004, occasional use when I wanted to read a label without asking for help. It had stayed in me the way things stay when you learn them young. Not perfectly, but completely. The vocabulary and the grammar settled into the same place where other permanent things lived. Beatrice had asked me if I'd studied French. I had told her a little, enough to get around. That was true. It was also, like most things I had said to her that week, incomplete. I went to my desk in the back room and found a notepad. I sat down and wrote, not in English first, and then translated directly in French, the way you write when the language is already there and you are only choosing words. Yves wrote, Béatrice, vous pensiez que je ne comprenais pas, mais j'ai entendu chaque mot, les papiers, le plan, tout, et je sais que vous avez l'intention de faire signer ma fille demain. Cela ne va pas se produire. I read it back. I changed one word. I read it again. Then I put the notepad in the desk drawer and went to bed. The light in the guest house was still on when I turned off my lamp. I lay in the dark and listened to the tide coming in through the open window, the sound of water moving over stone, patient and entirely indifferent to everything that was about to happen. Grant called at 8:04 in the morning. I was already dressed. I had been up since 6, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, watching the light come in off the water. The resort was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that comes before a large gathering, when the chairs are set and the flowers are arranged and no one has arrived yet to disturb any of it. I had walked down to the ceremony site at 6:30, just to look. White chairs in rows facing the water, a wooden arch draped in cream fabric. Molly had chosen everything herself. She had spent 4 months choosing it. My phone was on the table in front of me when it rang. Grant Hollis. I picked up on the second ring. Mark. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who has been awake for several hours organizing information. I had known Grant for 22 years. We had worked together on a highway drainage project outside of Portland in 2001, and when I needed someone to find things I couldn't find myself, he was the person I called. He was methodical, and he did not speculate. When he told you something, it was because he had confirmed it twice. I have everything. I set down my coffee cup. Go ahead. Jean-Luc's company, Maison Fontaine Imports, is insolvent. Has been for at least 18 months. He's been filing amended returns to delay the assessment. But the IRS has a lien on the business assets as of last March. Back taxes owed $2.3 million. There's a parallel case with the state of New York because they had a warehouse in Queens until 2 years ago. He closed it quietly. The state hasn't caught up yet, but they will. I looked at the water. A seagull landed on the railing of the deck and stood there, considering something. Julian, Grant said, there's an outstanding warrant in France. Issued in Lyon in 2021. Fraud. He took a deposit from a business partner for a wine distribution deal that never existed. The partner filed a criminal complaint. Julian left France 8 months later. The warrant is still active. Interpol has it flagged, but it hasn't been executed because he's been in the U.S. and no one's pushed for extradition. Yet. The seagull left the railing. And the property plan, Grant said. This is the part you need to hear carefully. They're not just looking for investment money. They're targeting you specifically. The property on Birchwood Road, the house where Molly grew up, I had it assessed through county records. Current market value is approximately $1.2 million. Beatrice has been in contact with a notary in Portland for the past 6 weeks. The document they want Molly to sign is a durable power of attorney, not for the wedding, not for formalities. It gives Beatrice legal authority to act on Molly's behalf in real estate transactions, which If Molly is listed as a co-beneficiary in your estate documents, would give Beatrice the right to mortgage the Birchwood Road property. The proceeds would go toward Jean-Luc's tax debt. I did not say anything for a moment. Outside, the water was still doing what it always does, moving in and pulling back, indifferent to everything on the shore. "They've done this before," Grant said. "Not this exact structure, but the pattern. In Lyon, before the fraud warrant, there was a similar arrangement with a woman whose son married into the family. She signed documents she didn't fully understand. She lost a vacation property. The case was settled civilly, and the records are partially sealed, but I found the original filing." "How long have they been planning this particular version?" I asked. "Based on the notary contact dates, at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. The power of attorney document was drafted before the engagement was formally announced. Mark, they had this ready before Molly knew she was getting married." I thought about the notepad in the desk drawer upstairs, the sentence I had written and then corrected, the light in the guest house that had been on when I turned off my lamp. "I need you at the wedding," I said. "Bring all the documents, the tax lien, the warrant, the notary correspondence, everything you have, printed and in order." A short pause. "I can be there by 10:30. "The ceremony starts at 11. Come to the side entrance of the main building. I'll leave your name at the desk." "Mark." His voice shifted slightly, not softer. "Exactly, but more careful. What are you going to do?" I stood up from the table and carried my coffee cup to the sink. "I'm going to tell the truth," I said, in French. He didn't respond to that immediately. Then, "Understood. I'll be there." I hung up and stood at the sink for a moment, looking out of the window at the path that led down to the ceremony site. The white chairs were still empty. The cream fabric on the arch moved very slightly in the wind off the water. 4 months of choosing. I put on my jacket and walked to the main building. Molly was in the bridal suite on the second floor, but I caught her in the hallway outside it, 30 minutes before the ceremony. She was already dressed ivory, simple, exactly what she would choose, and her hair was done, and she was carrying a small bouquet of white flowers that she kept adjusting with both hands. She looked up when she heard me in the hall. "Dad," she smiled, and then she looked at my face, and the smile changed. Not gone, just different. Molly has always been able to read me more accurately than I give her credit for. She got that from her mother. "You look serious. Is everything okay?" "I need to ask you something," I said, "before anything else happens today." She stopped adjusting the flowers. "Okay. Has Julian or his parents ever asked you to sign any documents?" The color changed in her face, not a flush, the opposite. A slow retreat of warmth, the way a room goes cold when someone opens a window in winter. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and in that moment I could see her deciding something, whether to answer directly, whether to ask how I knew, whether to say it was nothing. She chose directly. "How did you—" She stopped. Started again. "Yes, they said it was formalities. For the wedding, for the legal paperwork of combining households. Julian said it was standard in France, that his family's notary had prepared it. He said I should sign before the ceremony, so it wouldn't complicate things afterward." She looked at the flowers in her hands. "Dad, what's going on?" "The document is not a formality," I said. "It's a power of attorney that would give Beatrice the right to act on your behalf in real estate transactions. If you sign it, she has legal authority over your interest in the Birchwood Road property." Molly went very still. "Jean-Luc's business owes $2.3 million in back taxes. The company is insolvent. The document they want you to sign is the mechanism by which they intend to use the Birchwood Road property as collateral against that debt." I kept my voice level, not because I felt level, but because she needed information right now, not emotion. "I've had someone looking into this for the past several days. The warrant in France for Julian, that's real. The notary they've been in contact with here in Portland, that's real. All of it is documented." She put her hand against the wall, not leaning, just touching it, the way you reach for something solid when the floor feels uncertain. Her eyes were bright, and I watched her blink twice, deliberately, the way she used to when she was a child and was trying not to cry in front of people. "I thought it was strange," she said quietly. "I thought I told myself it was just cultural, that his family did things differently. Julian said his mother was very particular about paperwork." She looked up at me. "I almost signed it last night. Dad." She looked down at her hands. She was still holding a pen, a slim silver one. Julian's, the kind you carry in a jacket pocket. She hadn't noticed she was holding it. He had the papers with him at dinner. I had the pen in my hand. I said I wanted to read it again in the morning. "I know," I said, though I hadn't known that specific detail until she said it. I knew the shape of it. I had known the shape of it since the night at the restaurant when I had stood in the hallway and heard Beatrice's voice through the gap in the wall. "What are you going to do?" Molly asked. The same question Grant had asked me 20 minutes earlier, in the same tone, careful, a little afraid of the answer. "I'll explain everything after the ceremony," I said. "But right now, I need you to trust me. Don't sign anything today. Not a single page. If Julian or Beatrice or anyone asks you to sign something before or during or after the ceremony, tell them you need more time. Can you do that?" She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were still bright but steady. "Yes." "Good." She started to say something else, then stopped. "Then, is does he know, is he part of it? Or is he—" "I don't know yet how much Julian knows," I said, which was true. I had my suspicions, but suspicions are not the same as evidence, and I had spent 30 years in civil engineering learning the difference between what you think is there and what you can prove is there. That's one of the things we'll understand more clearly after today. She nodded slowly. One tear moved down her cheek, just one, and she pressed her thumb against it quickly, the way you stop a small thing before it becomes a larger one. Then she straightened her shoulders and looked at the flowers in her hands and adjusted them once, precisely. "Okay," she said, "after the ceremony." "After the ceremony," I said. "I'll be right there. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at me once more, the kind of look that doesn't need a word attached to it, and then she turned and went back toward the bridal suite. I watched her go. The door closed. The hallway was quiet. I walked downstairs and stood at the side entrance of the main building. At 10:34, Grant Hollis came through the door with a manila folder under his arm, thick enough that the edges of the papers inside were visible. He handed it to me without ceremony. I looked through the first 3 pages, the IRS lien document, the Interpol flag on the warrant, the email thread between Beatrice and the Portland notary, and then I closed the folder and held it at my side. "Thank you," I said. "You're sure about this?" he asked. I looked through the glass doors toward the ceremony site. The white chairs were beginning to fill. I could see Beatrice near the front row, in pale blue, speaking to someone I didn't recognize. Her posture was perfect. Her hands were composed. She looked exactly like a woman who believed everything was already settled. "Yes," I said. Grant nodded once and found a seat near the back. I stood there for another moment, holding the folder, watching the chairs fill. The water behind the arch caught the morning light and held it. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The ceremony was about to begin. The resort's main hall had been arranged for the reception the way someone had clearly planned for months. Round tables covered in ivory linen, low arrangements of white peonies and eucalyptus, candles not yet lit because the sun was still coming through the tall windows facing the water. The chairs from the ceremony had been moved inside. The caterers were moving quietly along the perimeter. Someone had placed small printed menus at each setting, folded like letters. I found my seat at the head table, set the folder on the chair beside me, and waited. Beatrice was 2 tables away. She had changed from the pale blue she'd worn for the ceremony into something darker, a charcoal wrap that looked expensive and deliberate. She was talking to the woman seated to her left, gesturing with one hand, her champagne glass held loosely in the other. She hadn't looked at me once since the ceremony ended. That was fine. I hadn't needed her to. Jean-Luc sat beside her, quieter than usual. He'd been quiet all week, actually quieter than a man who believed he was about to get everything he wanted should have been. I'd noticed that. I'd noticed most things. Molly was at the center of the head table, her hand in Julian's, still in her dress. She looked happy. That part was real. Her happiness was real, and it was the thing I had been most careful to protect throughout all of this. She had no idea what the week had actually contained. She knew her father had been polite to her future in-laws. She knew the wedding had come together. She did not know about Grant's phone call that morning, or the folder on the chair beside me, or Patricia Chen seated near the back of the room at a table with two other guests she'd come with. I had asked Patricia to sit near the back. She had agreed without asking why. She was that kind of person. The champagne was poured. The room settled into the particular quiet that precedes a toast glasses lifted halfway, conversations trailing off, people turning toward the head table, the wedding coordinator, a woman named Diane who had been managing the event all day with a headset and a clipboard, and the focused calm of someone who had done this 400 times, nodded at me from across the room. I stood up. I picked up my glass and waited for the room to fully quiet. It did. Even the caterers along the wall went still. "Good evening, everyone," I said. "I want to say a few words about my daughter, Molly." The room settled the rest of the way. Beatrice smiled. I saw it from where I stood, a composed, satisfied smile, the smile of a woman who expected nothing she wasn't prepared for. She lifted her glass slightly, ready. "Molly has always been kind, trusting, and generous," I said. "Those aren't words I say because it's her wedding day. They're words I've said about her since she was 6 years old and gave her lunch to a classmate who'd forgotten his. She has been that person her entire life, and I want her to stay that person." I paused, not for effect. I had learned years ago that pauses work best when they're not performed. I paused because I wanted to look at Molly. She was watching me with an expression I recognized the particular attention she gave when she sensed something was coming that she didn't yet understand. "But today," I said, "I need to tell her something important, something I learned just this morning." The smile on Beatrice's face didn't disappear. It changed. A small change, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that replaced the ease. Julian's hand, which had been resting on the table, moved to Molly's arm. He said nothing. I set my glass down on the table in front of me. I didn't need to hold it for what came next. I turned toward Beatrice and Jean-Luc's table, and I said, in French clearly, without hurry, in the French I had learned at 22 in Lyon and kept for 40 years, like a tool kept clean in a drawer. "Béatrice, Jean-Luc, vous pensiez que je ne comprenais pas, mais je parle français. J'ai entendu chaque mot au restaurant. Les insultes sur ma fille, le plan pour les papiers, la procuration, tout." The room did not erupt. It went the other direction. It compressed, the way air does before something breaks. Beatrice's face went the color of the ivory tablecloth. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her champagne glass was still raised at the angle it had been when she was still smiling, and she held it there for a moment like she'd forgotten it existed. Jean-Luc pushed back his chair. He was halfway to standing when I continued, still in English, still at the same volume, which was the volume of a man giving a toast at his daughter's wedding. "Julian," I said, "you told your mother I was predictable, that I would sign anything to make my daughter happy." I let that sit for exactly 1 second. You were right about one thing. I would do anything for Molly, but not this. Never this. Julian did not move. His hand was still on Molly's arm. Molly had turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was not one I could easily describe. It was the expression of someone watching a room rearrange itself around them and not yet knowing where to stand. "Molly will not be signing any papers today," I said. I picked up my glass again. "And if any of you attempt to contact her about this again, my attorneys will be in contact with you, with lawsuits, for fraud." I sat down. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted them the way I count things when I need to stay steady. Then Patricia Chen stood up from the table near the back. She was wearing a dark green blazer and the composed expression of someone who has testified before and knows exactly how much space to take up in a room. She said, "My name is Patricia Chen. I'm a licensed real estate broker, and I've been asked to serve as a witness to this proceeding." She held up the envelope she'd been carrying since she arrived. What Mark has described is accurate. I have documentation including correspondence and property records related to the power of attorney that was being sought. She set the envelope on the table in front of her and sat back down. The room started moving, not all at once in pieces, the way a crowd moves when it isn't sure whether to stay or go. The table near the windows, mostly Molly's friends from college, had gone very quiet. Two of Jean-Luc's associates near the far wall were leaning toward each other, speaking in low voices. One of them stood up, then the other. They did not look at Jean-Luc. They did not say anything to the room. They simply picked up their jackets from the backs of their chairs and walked toward the main exit, unhurried, in the particular silence of men who have decided a calculation has changed. Jean-Luc watched them go. His face did not move, but something behind it did. Julien pushed back his chair. He said something to Molly. I couldn't hear it and started to move away from the table. He made it 3 steps before Diane, the wedding coordinator, stepped directly into his path. She didn't touch him. She just stopped moving and stood there, and he stopped too, because there was nowhere obvious to go, and the room was watching. Julien. Molly's voice. She hadn't stood up. She was still at the table, her hands flat on the linen, and she said his name, the way you say a word when you've just realized it means something different than you thought. He turned back toward her. His face had lost whatever expression it had been holding. What was underneath was not anger and not grief. It was the blank recalibrating look of someone whose assumptions have just been removed from under them one by one. Beatrice had not moved. She was still in her chair, still at the same angle, the champagne glass finally lowered to the table. The color had not come back to her face. She was looking at the envelope Patricia had set down, and then she looked at me, and I held her gaze for a moment before I looked away. There was nothing in her expression I needed to respond to. Jean-Luc said something in French to the man seated beside him, a short sentence, clipped and low. I understood it. It was not relevant to anything that was going to happen next. Molly stood up. She was still in her dress, her bouquet on the table behind her, and she walked the 6 steps to where Julien was standing near the edge of the room. She said something to him that I couldn't hear. Whatever he said back made her close her eyes for a moment, not in pain, or not only in pain, in the way you close your eyes when something you already suspected becomes something you know. She turned and walked toward me. I stood up. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, how long have you known?" "Long enough," I said. She nodded. She was crying, but not the way people cry when something is lost. She was crying the way people cry when they finally put something down that was too heavy to carry. I put my hand on her shoulder. The room was still moving around us, voices, the sound of chairs. Diane speaking quietly into her headset near the door. Grant, from his seat near the back, had not moved. He caught my eye once and looked away. Patricia was still at her table, the envelope in front of her, waiting. Outside, through the tall windows, the water was flat and dark, and the last of the afternoon light was leaving it. I had said 1 sentence in French, 40 years of keeping that language like a tool in a drawer, and I had used it once, at the right moment, in the right room. Beatrice had heard every word. The wedding coordinator, Diane, had the particular efficiency of someone who had managed crises before and had no interest in managing them longer than necessary. She spoke into her headset for approximately 90 seconds, then walked to the center of the reception room and asked, in a voice that carried without being raised, that all guests move to the terrace while the venue staff addressed a logistical matter. She said it twice. Most people moved. Beatrice did not move immediately. She stood at her table with both hands flat on the white linen, and for a moment I thought she was going to say something to me, to the room, to anyone who would listen. Jean-Luc put his hand on her arm. She looked at him, then at me, then at the door. She picked up her bag. They walked out together through the side exit, not the main doors, and I watched them go. Julien was still at the front of the room near the altar arrangement, white roses that Molly had chosen herself 3 weeks ago in a shop on Exchange Street in Portland. He was looking at Molly. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the floor, her bouquet held at her side, and the distance between them was maybe 12 feet, and it might as well have been a different country. He said her name. She shook her head once, a small motion, and walked toward me. I held her. She was shaking in the way that has nothing to do with cold, the kind of shaking that comes after something has been held in for too long and the body finally decides it's finished holding. I didn't say anything. I had learned, a long time ago, that some moments don't need words. They just need someone to stand still inside them. After a while, she pulled back and looked at me. Her mascara had done what mascara does. She didn't seem to care. She said, "Dad, is it true everything you said?" I said, "Yes, sweetheart. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but you're safe now." She nodded. She looked back once at the altar, at the roses, at the room that was emptying around us. Then she looked at me again and said, "I trusted him." I said, "I know." She said, "He was going to use me." I didn't answer that. The answer was in the room. In the envelope Patricia was still holding at her table, in the 40 minutes of French I had listened to over 4 months without saying a word. Grant Ferris appeared at my left shoulder with the particular quiet of a man who has spent 30 years arriving at moments exactly when he is needed. He was carrying a folder, not the same one from the ceremony, a second one, thinner, with a blue tab along the edge. He said, "Mark," and I turned. He looked at Molly briefly, then back at me. He said, "I've already contacted the authorities. There's a warrant for Julien in France, and Jean-Luc's company is being investigated for tax fraud." I nodded. I had known about the warrant for 11 days. I had known about the tax investigation for 6. I had not told Molly either of those things because I had needed her to walk into the ceremony without that weight, without the particular kind of grief that comes from knowing too much too soon. Grant said, "The resort security has asked Beatrice and Jean-Luc to vacate the property tonight. They've agreed." He paused. "Julien is being asked to leave as well, and Mark on Julien specifically. We found a message thread on the notary correspondence. He wasn't a bystander. He drafted the timeline for when Molly would sign. He knew about the power of attorney before the engagement was announced." He opened the blue-tabbed folder to a printed page and set it on the table in front of me without comment. I looked at it for a moment, then closed the folder. "The Lion warrant is being forwarded to Interpol for active enforcement," Grant said. "They'll flag him at the border. He won't be going back to France quietly." I said, "Good." Molly was listening. She said, "What warrant?" Then quieter, "Did Julien know about all of it?" I looked at her. "Yes." I said, "He knew before he proposed." She closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she was steady. Grant looked at me. I said, "There's time for all of it." "Not tonight." I looked at her. "Tonight, you don't have to do anything except breathe." She nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they're not fully convinced but they trust the person speaking. I'd been working to deserve that nod for 28 years. It was the only thing in that room that mattered. That evening, after the guests had gone and the venue staff had begun the quiet work of dismantling what was supposed to have been a celebration, Molly sat with me on the terrace overlooking the water. She had changed out of her dress. She was wearing the gray sweater she'd had since college, the one with the frayed left cuff she never fixed. She said, "I can't marry him. I can't trust him." I said, "I know, and that's okay. You did the right thing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You knew for months." "Yes." "And you waited." "Yes." She looked at the water. A boat was crossing somewhere in the dark, its running lights small and steady. She said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" I thought about how to answer that. I said, "Because you needed to see it, not hear it from me. See it." I looked at her. "If I'd told you, you would have defended him. You loved him. That's not a flaw, that's who you are. But love needs to see clearly to survive. I needed you to see clearly." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "The French." I said, "Yes." She almost smiled. It was not a full smile, but it was the beginning of one. She said, "I didn't know you still spoke it." I said, "I kept it. I wasn't sure why. For a long time." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from a Portland attorney representing Jean-Luc's company, or what remained of it. The letter was 4 pages and used the word settlement 11 times. I read it once, set it on my kitchen table, and called my attorney, a woman named Susan Greer who had handled my contracts for 19 years and had the particular patience of someone who has seen every version of this kind of letter before. I told her, "Tell them no. Tell them I have everything they need to know about their scheme, and if they contact my daughter again, I'm pressing charges." Susan said, "Mark, they're ready to settle." I said, "I don't want their money. I want them gone from our lives." There was a brief silence on her end. Then she said, "Understood." She paused. "That'll cost them more, long term." I said, "I know." She filed the response that afternoon. A month after the wedding that didn't happen, a letter arrived with a Belgian postmark. The handwriting on the envelope was Beatrice's. I recognized it from the place cards she had written herself for the rehearsal dinner, each one in her careful, slightly forward-leaning cursive. I opened it. She had written 3 paragraphs. The last one said, "Mark, I'm sorry. I was wrong about you. You were never predictable. You were just patient." I read it twice. Then I folded it along its original crease, carried it to the fireplace in the living room, and set it on the logs. I watched it catch. It burned the way paper always burns quickly at the edges first, then the center, then nothing. I didn't need her apology. I had never needed it. What I had needed, from the first evening at Field in Maine when I sat across the table and heard her voice drop into French and begin, was for my daughter to be safe. That was the whole of it. The apology was Beatrice's to make or not make, and it changed nothing either way. Molly called that evening. She was in Portland, back in her apartment, and she sounded like herself tired, but herself. She said she had lunch with a friend that afternoon. She said the weather had been good. She asked if I wanted to drive down next weekend. I said I did. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside, the first real cold of November was settling over the water, the way it does every year in Maine quietly, without announcement, as if it had simply decided the time had come. I put the kettle on. I had other things to do. If you've ever sat quietly across a table from someone who underestimated you, who spoke as though you weren't there, as though your silence meant absence, you already understand why the fire was the right place for that letter. Not anger, not triumph, just the clean end of something that no longer needed to be carried. These stories find me the same way they find you, in the details that don't announce themselves. If that's something you recognize, I'll be here.